Howard Thurman. So I'm really excited about seeing that. I'd like to begin with a few words. Dominique's here. Yay! She's going to be one of our student readers today. I think Max is coming too, so he's finishing up work. But let's begin with a prayer from Howard Thurman, which I will read for us together as we begin. Our little lives, our big problems, these we place upon your altar. The quietness in your temple of silence again and again rebuffs us. For some, there is no discipline to hold them steady in the waiting, and the minds reject the noiseless invasion of your spirit. For some, there is no will to offer what is central in the thoughts. The confusion is so manifest, there is no starting place to take hold. For some, the evils of the world tear down all concentrations and scatter the focus of the high resolves. We do not know how to do what we know to do. We do not know how to be what we know to be. Our little lives, our big problems, these we place upon your altar. Pour out upon us whatever our spirits need of shock, of life, of release, that we may find strength for these days, courage and hope for tomorrow. In confidence, we rest in your sustaining grace, which makes possible triumph in defeat, gain in loss, and love in hate. We rejoice this day to say, our little lives, our big problems, these we place upon your altar. Amen. So Howard Washington Thurman was born in 1899 and died in 1981, but I think his words still hold so much power for us. My acquaintance, I'd like to call him friend, Martin Doblmeyer, has joined us from Northern Virginia, from Alexandria. And he has, through his film company, Journey Films, has made a beautiful documentary on Howard Thurman. So Caroline Carr is going to show us that trailer, and then she's going to share her screen. We're going to hear a few words from Martin about his relationship with Dr. Thurman, what he learned. And just to kind of give you a heads up in our time at the next hour, then Dominique and Max and I are going to do some readings from Dr. Thurman, and we're going to together have a sort of a Zoom conversation, whatever that looks like. And then as we close our time, we're going to hear from Professor Amy Marga, who's joining us from St. Paul, Minnesota. She's a professor at the Lutheran Seminary there. And I thought, especially being in St. Paul, Minneapolis, to be hearing Thurman and sort of seeing what's coming up for her as we finish our time together. So that's the plan. And I'm just so happy to welcome you all into this space today. So Caroline Carr.
Let's make sure this works.
Yeah.
Do you see? Is it?
We don't see the trailer. That's something different.
Oh no. Zoom. Do you see the conversations with Howard Thurman?
Yeah, that's not the one we want.
Okay. I'm sorry. I had the wrong thing pulled up. That's on my fault. So I'm going to stop sharing really fast and find our right.
Howard, what should she, Martin, what should she search for the trailer?
Yeah.
I think we do have the trailer. I mean, she can go to journeyfilms.com and find it there. It is on YouTube, though.
Yeah,
right? If you
we want to see it on YouTube.
Yep.
What's the title of the film, Martin?
The film is called Backs Against the Wall, the Howard Thurman story.
Got it. Sorry, guys. Technical.
All good.
Trying to single-handedly debunk the myth that people from my generation are good at computers. Because I'm not. No, we're having Wi-Fi problems, but
we're all learning.
We are.
Well, while you're finding that, Martin, why don't you tell us a little bit about you know, what Howard Thurman has meant in your life, or what you learned, or what surprised you?
Well, this film on, I think she found it.
I did. I didn't realize
Oh.
it was playing on the, I did. Do you want me to go ahead and play it?
Yeah, go ahead. Go for it.
Oh, we're going to play it through. Found it through Facebook.
Awesome.
There we go. Okay.
Great.
Son of slaves, yet Howard Thurman would become one of the most celebrated religious figures of the 20th century. A spiritual mentor to Martin Luther King Jr.
Whether we want it that way or not, we all tied together.
And a moral anchor for the civil rights movement.
Martin Luther King Jr. would quote Howard Thurman on many, many occasions.
I think Howard Thurman, for many leaders in that movement, King included, played the role of pastor.
In the 1930s, after an historic meeting with Mahatma Gandhi, Thurman becomes one of the early voices for nonviolent resistance for people who over centuries experienced unimaginable violence.
He helped to establish the philosophical framework of how to struggle.
He saw himself as a spiritual activist because he was fundamentally a teacher. He had this combination of being kind and being strong, and I think that's a very rare combination.
While Sunday morning was often considered the most segregated hour in the week, Thurman helped pioneer a church where people of different races and religions could worship together.
He's suspicious of denomination and dogma and creed. He would never identify himself as a theologian because he thought theologians boxed God.
And he was called a mystic because he believed religious experience was best explored within.
Howard Thurman was actually practicing contemplative spirituality before we actually started calling it contemplative spirituality.
At his heart, he was a nature mystic.
Thurman is talking to trees. Trees.
Yet this mystic was also an outspoken critic of Christianity for its part in the nation's deep racial divides. And he countered with a shocking new work that offered a revolutionary new way of understanding the life of Jesus Christ and how it speaks directly to the oppressed and disinherited.
I carry the book with me, Jesus and the Disinherited, every day.
And he gives an Africanity to the interpretation of Jesus. He provided a spiritual perspective that was empowering.
There were people encountering Thurman's work and being shaken at their core.
I would have to find out what was the word that the religion of Jesus had to say to the man with his back against the wall.
Awesome.
Thank you. Martin, what does that bring up for you today?
Well, thanks, Karen. Well, I'll have to say what was interesting. I'm in the midst of doing a series of biographical documentary films, and we're calling them prophetic voices. And so, in some ways, we're counting Bonhoeffer, which we did 20 years ago, as one of those films that we'll actually eventually put into the series. But it includes Reinhold Niebuhr, Howard Thurman, the latest film, Dorothy Day, and the one that I'm going right back into finishing the edit on this week, on Abraham Joshua Heschel. And to me, these are characters that I think continue because of the way they understood how God was speaking to them and the courage that they had, their depth of knowledge of their own traditions and other traditions that they were part of, that they continue to resonate today for all of us. And I think you too, you've done so much work in seeing and understanding theology through a narrative form. We call it narrative theology, and you've done biographical work for years, and important biographical work, and you can get to so much profound material through telling the stories of the lives of others. And that's basically what the series is really all about, an opportunity to do that. And for me, Thurman was a natural because a number of reasons. Number one, I went to graduate school at Boston University. And so Howard Thurman, who was the dean of the Marsh Chapel at Boston University for 10 years, a decade, he was still being talked about when I went there many years after he had long left. He was still part of the culture and the DNA of Boston University. So he's been on my radar for a long time. And I just thought in the mix of doing these films about these important characters, Howard Thurman was a natural to do it. And what's been really wonderful is with every film I do now, not only do we broadcast it on television, on public television, but I do my best to go out and do screening events around the country where I can engage the audience, listen to what it is they're getting from the film, see what they respond to, and what pivots them into thinking about how that character or that storyline fits their own lives. And I can't tell you how many times, Karen, I'd be out doing the Howard Thurman presentations, and people would come to me and say, you know, thank you for doing the film, because Howard Thurman was part of my own personal spiritual journey for so long. I heard many people say, I never heard of Howard Thurman, and then others tell me again and again how important he was to them in their own spiritual journey. And that's the reason why we're thrilled to have had a chance to share it with millions of people.
Well, I would invite anyone participating. We have 15 people on the Zoom call. If you'd like to chat in a question for Martin or make a comment while you're thinking about that, Martin. So you're in in Alexandria, Virginia. I think as the University of Virginia returns, whatever that looks like, we could have maybe a double feature film festival with. I think my picks would be Dorothy Day and Howard Thurman for sure, and maybe Bonhoeffer. We could do a triple.
And wait till you see the Heschel film, because Heschel's a really interesting and provocative character. And I have to say, what's so interesting to me about Thurman is that there are a lot of people who see him as almost dangerous in some ways, because he's sort of this soft spirituality that you can't really put your hands on. You're not quite sure of where he's coming from. But the truth of the matter is the reading that you just offered a few minutes ago says that this is a man who had a deep hunger search for God. And seeing God through his eyes, I think, can add, for any of us, can add a whole new dimension about how God is real for a person like Howard Thurman, and that how propels him to act in certain ways. And I think that's what's most admirable. So for me as a filmmaker, I have to remember that I have a broadcast audience, which is an audience that most likely knows little about Howard Thurman. And what's going to be the hook to get them to actually watch the film? It's going to be how he interprets his calling from God into social transformation. How did he impact the civil rights movement and social justice in America? So that's kind of my entry point to Thurman. So when I unpack the story, I talk about that. But the truth of the matter is, I think today, in our religious landscape, the way that Howard Thurman is more often being remembered is as that mystic, that person who could put language and poetry together with the unpacking of who God is in our world today and how that calls us to live. So you can't go on a retreat anywhere in America and not hear opening commentary from read by Howard Thurman. I was with a gathering a couple of days ago with people who had no idea I had made the film. They wanted to open up the evening prayer with a quote from Howard Thurman. So he remains out there for his poetry and his understanding of God, but at the same time, what drove me to make the film, I think, was his interaction with the social injustices of America and his challenges and his calls for Christianity to get right what it calls itself to do.
Thank you. Any responses or questions? Feel free to unmute yourself. You have the power, or chat your question or comment. I think the first quote I ever heard from Thurman, which looking back on it, it's the least typical Thurman quote, I think, is, and I did ask Luther Smith, one of your experts, did he really say this? And apparently he did that, the quote that don't ask what the world needs. Can you say that quote, or somebody fill me in? I don't want to misquote him.
So actually, we have it in the film, Karen, and it's actually spoken by Oprah Winfrey. And she spoke that line. She said that Howard Thurman, as she was speaking at the commencement at Harvard University, 2013. And she says, my favorite theologian, Howard Thurman, said this: don't ask what the world needs. Ask yourself what makes you come alive. Because what the world needs is people who've come alive. Now, to me, that's an absolute, that's the classic bumper sticker, sort of the difference between, you know, career and ministry, career and vocation. You know, we talk a lot today in terms of what's your career? And I think most people would answer that question by saying, I'm going to look for this in the society where I can actually find myself employable, where I can actually get a job, I can sustain, I can buy the things that I think I need to have to live in our culture and society today. But what Thurman is saying is, be true to yourself. Understand who you are in this world, your role in the world, and what really ultimately God made you to do. And then that will make you come alive. So when I speak at universities and seminaries and things like that, I often quote that quote from Howard Thurman, because I think it's central, but it's also a call, not only in terms of vocation and job, but also the purpose of your life. What do you really feel ultimately the purpose of what are you here on this earth for? That's the existential question we all have to deal with. And we can avoid it by just sort of going out and getting our job and doing what we think is the proper thing to do, or we can actually confront it like Thurman calls us to do.
Martin, we have two questions for you. One, do you hear young, and this is for Professor Marga or anybody else who's out and about these days, the question is, do you hear young white and Black people quoting him today in discussion of the current unrest? The other question is, what precautions do you take or extra care do you give to making documentaries about women and or people of color as a white man? So you could respond to either of those, and Amy.
Yeah, no, I'll do both. Yes, I think that I'm hearing Howard Thurman quoted across the racial spectrum. I'm hearing him quoted by male and female, and I think he's actually begun. There's a revival on Howard Thurman going on, I think, in this country, because I think we have a hunger, a spiritual hunger, and we're trying to figure out how that all plays out in the social unrest that we see today. So yeah, I do think that Howard Thurman is sort of back in a bit in the air right now, and I think that's going to be a very helpful thing. And so for me as a filmmaker, you know, the Dorothy Day film, which we just released, is my 35th film. I've made 35 films, and we hope we're getting better at it. But I'm a documentary filmmaker, so I have to have a framework out of which I realize that I'm speaking to a very plural audience in this country. And I'm always aware of that in terms of what Bonhoeffer would think of in terms of, you know, sort of a religious appreciation, religious literacy. You know, what's the audience like in terms of language that we can use? So I'm cognizant of the traditional ways that we break ourselves apart, meaning gender and race and education and economics and everything. But I'm also very sensitive to the way people divide religiously in this country, as those who hold dear to a particular faith tradition, others who are very, very suspicious today about anything that has to do with religion. And I think if I do anything now, I'm probably more aware of that second group than anything else. When I deliver a film to public television, I'm keenly aware that the majority of people don't know, if I'm doing a biographical series, who these individuals are. And they're suspicious of anything that reeks of religion. And I think they feel as though they speak on behalf of what they think is their wider audience that's very concerned about anything that smells of religion that might be in any way proselytizing. And so I have to take the unpacking of our theology in these films slowly, carefully, sort of playing to an audience that I think has to be led thoughtfully into the story of who these people are. I think Dorothy Day is a very challenging character. Howard Thurman can be very challenging. And you can't just smack people in the face with them. You have to sort of unpack them slowly and in a way that they feel comfortable with. But the audiences are coming out, Karen, for the film, and we're thrilled about that. I think it speaks to a deep hunger in America for characters that they can sort of relate to, that are religious and courageous.
Yeah, yeah. Here's a question sort of related. What advice, Martin, do you give to white allies who are educating themselves with your films, especially during this time of protest?
No, that's a really good question. I think that I think that we have to. I think as a white, if you're asking me as a white male, I have to be aware of the fact that I will not have the experience. I will not have the sensitivity that an African American would in terms of what's going on in the streets in this country today. But I think the most important thing for me to say is that I'm listening and I'm trying my best to understand. I'm with you. I understand. I may not understand every aspect of what's happening. I may not be able to feel it and be sensitive to it like you might be. I've never been pulled over, frankly, in a car simply because of my color. As far as I know, that's never happened. But I need to be aware of the fact that that's happening all across this country, and I have to be sensitive to the fact that there's a lot of pain that's going on in this country right now, and if I care about other people in terms of how God is present in their life, like Tolstoy would say, that the God within them is being manifest in all different ways right now, I have to be open to that and find my way to show love and compassion for it.
Thank you. Final question for you before we move into our time of reading. We have on theologicalhorizons.org, we do have a virtual vintage page, so we're going to put links to your work there. Is there any way to see the film other than a screening with you?
Well, you can, some of the films remain public on public television, PBS, so you could go to your local public television and you can put in Dorothy Day. And you can put in Howard Thurman, which I think is still available for streaming via that, and we have DVDs for sale. So the films are out there and accessible. So
Great. Well, we'll look forward to that. And just from the trailer and just to see the people that you brought on, you've got a real wealth of expertise there and comments. So thank you for the good work you're doing up the road. We look forward to seeing you in Charlottesville. And
I'd love to get down there and spend a little bit more time with you and Charles and talk about all these different things that are happening. Again, congratulations with the good work that you're doing. It's really important work, Karen. So that's why I wanted to be here and say congratulations to you.
Thank you. Well, we're all together, which is, we need that more than ever, I think. Thank you.
I'm going to jump off if that's okay. I've got a script to deliver. So
you are released.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Okay, great. Well, let's move into some time of reading, especially for those of us who don't know so much of the work of Howard Thurman. I'll just make a few comments. He was born in 1899 in Florida. He was the grandson of enslaved Americans there. There's a lot to his story. One of the sort of small bits I find fascinating is that he was very close to his grandmother Nancy, and he would read the Bible to her, and she had been enslaved on a plantation, and she never let him read from St. Paul, because St. Paul was the one who said, slaves, be obedient to your masters, and she would have none of that. So he would say in his life that more than any of the theologians or the professors that he had learned the most of the religion of Jesus from his grandmother. And her influence was so important in his life. And he left to receive an education. I'm going to get some of the details wrong, but did his undergrad in Atlanta, received his doctoral degree, divinity degree, was as he said, the chaplain at Boston University, was very well known as a preacher. And in the trailer, we see footage of him, and there were, you could hear him on the radio preaching. Time magazine named him one of the great preachers of America. And one very important part of his story is that he traveled to India as part of this delegation of Black Americans who were sent there basically to represent Christianity, because the British colonials had made quite a hash of the story of Christianity in India with their imperial domination. So they sent Thurman, and they did a tour of India, and Thurman met Gandhi, and they had a profound time together in which Thurman learned from Gandhi the principles of passive nonviolence and the power of love, and brought that philosophy back to the United States. And of course, this led us into sort of the architecture of the civil rights movement. Thurman moved to San Francisco, and they founded this Church of the Fellowship for All Peoples. And it was the first interracial, sort of intercultural church project in America. He wrote Jesus and the Disinherited in 1949. So we're going to read some words from that. But as we read, I want us all to hold that thought. 1949 in America. This was the time and the context in which he worked. And we know that the leaders of the American civil rights movement, King in particular. This book was very important to them. We've heard that King kept a copy with him in his pocket. Amy may know some details about a lot of this, but it's a very fascinating work, especially today in this time. So Dominique and Max and I are going to read some passages together, taking turns, and then we're going to pause and reflect on this. You're welcome. I know this is, again, a format that's challenging. I wish you were here at the Bonhoeffer House in the living room with me eating lunch, but alas. We'll do our best to add into the chat box or unmute yourselves and speak out, but just to reflect as we go. So I'm going to begin with a few words from the foreword to the book that Vince Harding wrote. And I will mention that this reading is, if you don't have it, you don't need it, but it's at the Theological Horizons website under the vintage /vintage. Okay, so let's begin. Vince Harding says this about the book. This work is a profound quest for a liberating spirituality, a way of exploring and experiencing those crucial life points where personal and societal transformation are creatively joined. Ultimately, Thurman's goal was to offer this humanizing combination as the basis for an emancipatory way of being, moving toward a fundamentally unchained life that is available to all the women and men everywhere who hunger and thirst for righteousness, especially those who stand with their backs against the wall. In essence, he was surveying the world of the oppressed and asking how it might be possible for human beings to endure the terrible pressures of the dominating world without losing their humanity, without forfeiting their souls. And there was never any doubt in his mind that the life and teachings of Jesus, the poor Jew of Nazareth, the disinherited, threatened subject of Roman power, were especially relevant to the ever-present contingent of Black men and women who lined the serrated, cutting surfaces of the wall called America. A profound piece of surgery has to take place in the very psyche of the disinherited before the great claim of the religion of Jesus can be presented. The great stretches of barren places in the soul must be revitalized, brought to life before they can be challenged. Shall we gather at the wall? This phrase in this passage, he speaks of the Black men and women who lined the serrated, cutting surfaces of the wall called America. Where do you see this wall? He wrote this in 1949. What does this phrase mean to you today?
I think, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
It's terrible in here, but I think that it is a very descriptive, like, depiction of marginalization, serrated, cutting surfaces, like the outskirts. It depicts, I think, lives of Black Americans and their hardships and struggles as they're living on the outside, or not really being within the wall, I guess. I mean, America as a wall, that can be a different concept of in itself, but just as far as being on the serrated cutting surfaces, I just think of like a detachment, a sort of exclusion, and even more so a rough exclusion, purposeful and deliberate and painful.
Thank you. Is anything else coming up for you, or any other phrase that you heard in this first reading? Or
I think for me, especially with what's going on today, I see this serrated, cutting wall of America, in how protesters are being treated. But even before all of this stuff, I saw it at the border, and how we were treating immigrants. Even before that, I saw it at the prisons, where many people of color were being cut out from society, in places that would make society a safer place, according to the views of some.
Thank you so much for adding that. It's really, really useful. Well, let's continue. We have much text here, and we're not going to get through all of it, but we're going to begin with Max. Our friend Max here is going to read this first section from Jesus and the Disinherited. So these are Dr. Thurman's words.
The significance of the religion of Jesus to the people who stand with their backs against the wall has always seemed to me to be crucial. It is one emphasis which has been lacking, except where it has been part of a very unfortunate corruption of the missionary impulse, which is, in a sense, the very heartbeat of the Christian religion. My interest in the problem has been and continues to be both personal and professional. This is the question which individuals and groups who live in our land, always under the threat of profound social and psychological displacement, face. Why is it that Christianity seems impotent to deal radically and therefore effectively with the issues of discrimination and injustice on the basis of race, religion, and national origin? Is this impotency due to a betrayal of the genius of the religion, or is it due to a basic weakness in the religion itself? The question is searching for the dramatic demonstration of the impotency of Christianity in dealing with the issue is underscored by its apparent inability to cope with it within its own fellowship. I am deeply convinced that in the general area of inquiry is to be found the answer, without which there can be little hope that men may find in Christianity the fulfillment which it claims for its gospel.
Thank you. So the question is, how do you hear Thurman's words today? I think this is going to be the question throughout the reading, not specific questions, but like, how are you hearing these words? Or what do you hear in these words?
I hear that Christianity is not doing its job. That's, I think, what the biggest takeaway I hear from it. It's critical and it's not living up to the true purpose that it claims.
Thank you.
I heard a lot of what I think Dom was saying, and I also think when listening to passages like this, I'm really struck between the difference between Christianity and the church, and how there's actually a really big difference between what we read as Christian texts or what we find in the gospel, and then how that's lived out in the institution of the church. And maybe how the church has failed to do Christianity's job in a lot of ways, which is just a question I think I've been pondering a lot lately. Mm-hmm. How good has the church been as an institution at actually living out the gospel?
Mm-hmm.
Hi, for me, I'm out in St. Paul, Minnesota, and it's been very interesting to watch how clergy are just working very hard in the Twin Cities to be a part of all this, like in a good way. And I'm interested in all the people on Facebook and the pastors who have been saying things like, after the pandemic and our churches have closed, we had to figure out how to be church differently. And the pandemic has almost prepared these clergy to be just out and about in the world. And so I'm interested, like, I think that Christianity has been in America definitely impotent in dealing with some of these issues, but I feel hopeful that maybe this generation of leaders, at least in my area of the country, I don't know how far we'll get, but I think they're trying to actually say, no, we belong out here on the streets with you, and we are going to risk our safety for standing in solidarity.
Thank you, Amy. Dominique, would you read the next passage? I want to be mindful that we want to get as much Howard as we can here. Thank you for these comments. It's very useful.
Yes, so the next one. I belong to a generation that finds very little that is meaningful or intelligent in the teachings of the church concerning Jesus Christ. For years, it has been a part of my own quest so to understand the religion of Jesus that interest in his way of life could be developed and sustained by intelligent men and women who were at the same time deeply victimized by the Christian church's betrayal of his faith. The solution which Jesus found for himself and for Israel as they faced the hostility of the Greco-Roman world becomes the word and the work of redemption for all the cast down people in every generation and age. I mean this quite literally. I do not ignore the theological and metaphysical interpretation of the Christian doctrine of salvation, but the underprivileged everywhere have long since abandoned any hope that this type of salvation deals with the crucial issues by which their days are turned into despair without consolation. The basic fact is that Christianity, as it was born in the mind of this Jewish teacher and thinker, appears as a technique of survival for the oppressed. That it became, through the intervening years, a religion of the powerful and the dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression, must not tempt us into believing that it was thus in the mind and life of Jesus. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. Wherever his spirit appears, the oppressed gather for a fresh courage, for he announced the good news that fear, hypocrisy, and hatred, the three hounds of hell that track the trail of the disinherited, need have no dominion over them.
Thank you. How do you hear Howard Thurman's words in this moment, these words? Is there any phrase or sentence that you would like to call out that you heard here?
I think the very first, I'm also in St. Paul, part of Amy Marie's class. The very first sentence on number 3, I belong to a generation that finds very little that is meaningful or intelligent in the teachings of the church concerning Jesus Christ. We live in a time where there is a lot of work to be done, and it's intriguing to me to watch how some conversations are stuck around, well, when are we going to have in-person worship services again, versus when are we going to make this a religion and a faith that is accessible and acceptable to all people and doesn't further marginalize. Because Thurman is talking, there's another quote in his book where he's talking about traditional Christianity in the US pits the strong against the weak. When are we going to have that conversation? Because now is the time. Pandemic aside, it's always been the time.
Thank you.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And I think the one that stood out to me also was that it became a religion of the powerful and the dominant, used sometimes as an instrument of oppression. And I think that kind of cycles back to why this generation doesn't find it very meaningful or solution-oriented, because it's now not used for uplifting and getting people out of oppression. It's actually causing it. And so there's no use in joining that bandwagon if it literally is the cause of what you're experiencing. Or think that it's the cause, or people have adopted it as the cause. So.
Well, continuing on, Dr. Thurman says this: to those who need profound succor and strength to enable them to live in the present with dignity and creativity, Christianity has often been sterile and of little avail. A religion that was born of a people acquainted with persecution and suffering has too often been secured by a ruthless use of power applied to weak and defenseless people. It is exceedingly difficult to hold oneself free from a certain contempt for those whose predicament makes moral appeal for defense and succor. It has long been a matter of serious moment that for decades we have studied the various peoples of the world and those who live as our neighbors as objects of missionary endeavor and enterprise without being at all willing to treat them either as brothers or as human beings. It is urgent that my meaning be crystal clear. The masses of men live with their backs constantly against the wall. They are the poor, the disinherited, the dispossessed. What does our religion say to them? The issue is not what it counsels them to do for others whose need may be greater, but what religion offers to meet their own needs. The search for an answer to this question is perhaps the most important religious quest of modern life. So how do you hear Howard Thurman's words in this moment, these words?
Here's Amy again in St. Paul. I think what's interesting in this passage for me is that what so many people in Minneapolis and St. Paul need, especially people of color, or especially Black people, need safety. And I don't know what resources the Christian tradition has to meet the basic need of feeling safe. And that to me is worrisome about our tradition. Where can we find those places in the Bible that God or Jesus, promises safety?
I think continuing off of that, the thing that jumped into my mind, Thurman is kind of, I think it talks in the forward how he's kind of a liberation theologian before that was really a thing, before Gutierrez. And the ironic part of that to me is that the whole life of Christ, like this theology that is apparently intrinsic to the Bible, to Christianity then, one could argue, is liberation. Like it is a liberation theology, and yet it's become so twisted that we have to have liberation theology just to have those conversations. Yeah.
Well, let's continue. Max, would you read the next section 5, please? Thank you.
What then is the word of the religion of Jesus to those who stand with their backs against the wall? There must be the clearest possible understanding of the anatomy of the issues facing them. They must recognize fear, deception, hatred, each for what it is. Once having done this, they must learn how to destroy these or to render themselves immune to their domination. In so great an undertaking, it will become increasingly clear that the contradictions of life are not ultimate. The disinherited will know for themselves that there is a spirit at work in life and in the hearts of men which is committed to overcoming the world. It is universal, knowing no age, no race, no culture, and no condition of men. For the privileged and underprivileged alike, if the individual puts at the disposal of the Spirit the needful dedication and discipline, he can live effectively in the chaos of the present, the high destiny of a son of God.
Thank you. And Dominique, would you continue the reading, please? Do you mind?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jesus was a Jew. The miracle of the Jewish people is almost as breathtaking as the miracle of Jesus. The second important factor for our consideration is that Jesus was a poor Jew. The third fact is that Jesus was a member of a minority group in the midst of a larger dominant and controlling group. A word of caution is urgent at this point. To place Jesus against the background of his time is by no means sufficient to explain him. Who can explain a spiritual genius, or any kind of genius for that matter? Jesus inherited the same traits as countless other Jews of his time. He grew up in the same society, and yet he was Jesus, and the others were not. Uniqueness always escapes us as we undertake an analysis of character. In the midst of this psychological climate, Jesus began his teaching and his ministry. His words were directed to the house of Israel, a minority within the Greco-Roman world, smarting under the loss of status, freedom, and autonomy, haunted by the dream of the restoration of a lost glory and former greatness. His message focused on the urgency of radical change in the inner attitude of the people. He recognized fully that out of the heart are the issues of life, and that no external force, however great and overwhelming, can at long last destroy people if it does not first win the victory of the spirit against them. To revile because one has been reviled, this is the real evil because it is the evil of the soul itself. Jesus saw this with almighty clarity. Again and again, he came back to the inner life of the individual. With increasing insight and startling accuracy, he placed his finger on the inward center as the crucial arena where the issues would determine the destiny of his people. It was this kind of atmosphere that characterized the life of the Jewish community when Jesus was a youth in Palestine. The urgent question was what must be the attitude toward Rome. Was any attitude possible that would be morally tolerable and at the same time preserve a basic self-esteem, without which life could not possibly have any meaning? No Jewish person, hold on, let me read that again. I don't think I read that right.
Okay.
Was any attitude possible that would be morally tolerable and at the same time preserve a basic self-esteem, without which life cannot possibly have any meaning? No Jewish person of the period could deal with the question of his practical life, his vocation, his place in society, until first he had settled deep within himself this critical issue. This is the position of the disinherited in every age. What must be the attitude toward the rulers, the controllers of political, social, and economic life?
Thank you, Max. Thanks, Dominique. How do you hear these words of Howard Thurman's in this moment? Again, feel free to unmute yourself or chat, however you like to respond.
I would say for me, it was encouraging to hear this because my work is I bring diverse people together and help them learn how to build healthy relationships across cultures. But the hardest group for me to recruit is Black people. And so I go around to different Black churches just telling people, or, just sharing the message that we have to, I'll steal words from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Okay.
As people who have been hurt, we have to suspend our judgment and our hatred so that we can try to be in conversation with those people who have oppressed and hurt us. And that's not doing a favor for them. That's a benefit for everybody on all sides of the conflict.
And what kind of responses do you get, Pam?
It varies. So typically from older Black people, they're like, yeah, you're right. The other thing I share with people is that, so my belief is that the more people we have, and particularly the more white people that are in relationships with people of color, that opens their understanding and their information base. And then that helps to bring heart level change and transformation. And so then now they're ready to be an advocate and to speak out to friends and family and church members. And so when I explain it that way, then I do get more people of color willing to engage. There are still some that are just resistant. And I understand that because some have been hurt more than others. And then we all have different ways of coping with the hurts that come at us daily. And so I understand that. I just keep sharing the message and keep talking to people.
Thank you for telling us about your work. What is is there an organization that you work with that we could put on our page or help make connections for you?
Yes, it's called Visible Unity.
Mm-hmm. And where are you based, Pam?
I'm in Dallas, Texas.
All right. Well, we'll follow up with you, Pam, and see, what kind of other connections are there between us. It sounds like such a great work that you're doing. So thank you for making the time to be with us today. Beautiful.
Yeah. So is most everybody else from Minnesota?
I'm based in Charlottesville. Caroline Theological Horizons is based in Charlottesville, Virginia, but Amy is a professor and brought her class, and so we're in all different places, which is like one of the benefits of Zoom. But anyway, glad you made it across over to Eastern Standard Time or whatever.
Right. And I apologize for being late.
Oh, no, there's no late. We're not at all. We work with undergraduates, so there is no late. That's not a category. Well, for our final reading, let's go ahead and let's see. Let's just keep reading. I'll read a section, and then Max, and then Dom, and then we'll conclude the reading. And I asked Amy if she might share some words from her point of view, and we'll end at 2. So we don't have a lot of time, but let's just hear these words from Dr. Thurman. It seems clear that Jesus understood. Am I in the right spot? Yeah. It seems clear that Jesus understood the anatomy of the relationship between his people and the Romans, and he interpreted that relationship against the background of the profoundest ethical insight of his own religious faith as he had found it in the heart of the prophets of Israel. Living in a climate of deep insecurity, Jesus, faced with so narrow a margin of civil guarantees, had to find some other basis upon which to establish a sense of well-being. He knew that the goals of religion, as he understood them, could never be worked out within the then established order. Deep from within that order, he projected a dream, the logic of which would give to all the needful security. There would be room for all, and no man would be a threat to his brother. The kingdom of God is within. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. The basic principles of his way of life cut straight through the despair of his fellows and found it groundless. By inference, he says, you must abandon your fear of each other and fear only God. You must not indulge in any deception and dishonesty, even to save your lives. Your words must be yea, nay. Anything else is evil. Hatred is destructive to hated and hater alike. Love your enemy, that you may be children of your Father who is in heaven. Max, can you take the next?
Jesus rejected hatred. It was not because he lacked the vitality or the strength. It was not because he lacked the incentive. Jesus rejected hatred because he saw that hatred meant death to the mind, death to the spirit, death to the communion with his Father. He affirmed life, and hatred was the great denial. The religion of Jesus says to the disinherited, love your enemy. Take the initiative in seeking ways by which you can have the experience of a common sharing of mutual worth and value. It may be hazardous, but you must do it. For the Negroes means that he must see the individual white man in the context of a common humanity. The fact that a particular individual is white and therefore may be regarded in some overall sense as the racial enemy must be faced, and opportunity must be provided, found, or created for freeing such an individual from his white necessity. From this point on, the relationship becomes like any other primary one. Once an attack is made on the enemy status and the individual has emerged, the underprivileged man must himself be status-free. It may be argued that his sense of freedom must come first. Here, I think the answer may be determined by the one who initiates the activity. But in either case, love is possible only between two freed spirits. What one discovers in even a single experience in which barriers have been removed may become useful in building an overall technique for loving one's enemy. There cannot be too great insistence on the point that we are dealing with a discipline, a method, a technique, as over against some form of wishful thinking or desiring.
As to the psychological tools of nonviolence, their purpose is to open the door of the heart so that what another is feeling and experiencing can find its way within. They assume it is possible for a man to get real insight into the meaning of his deeds, attitudes, or way of life as they affect the life of his fellows. A man faces with nonviolence is forced to deal with himself. Finally, every way of escape is ultimately cut off. The purpose of nonviolent acts is not merely to change an odious situation, but further to make it urgent for a man to face himself and his action. Finally, all must face the same basic question. Is what I am doing an expression of my fundamental intent toward any man when I am most myself? The more persistent nonviolent acts become, the more threatening they are to the person who refuses to deal with the ultimate question. The purpose of his use of nonviolence as a collective device is to awaken conscience and an awareness of the evil of a violent system, to make it available the experience of the collective destiny in which all people in the system are participating. And this is, at last, the work of reconciliation. The discipline for all who are involved has the same aim, to find a way to honor what is deepest in one person and to have that person honor what is deepest in the other.
Thank you for that reading. There's so much there. So Amy, wrap it up in 3 minutes, would you? No, how is Thurman speaking to you today in Minneapolis, St. Paul? Amy is a professor at the Lutheran Seminary. There's some of her, for any of you who are just coming in, some of her students are with us, and they are reading Jesus and the Disinherited. So yeah, just would love to hear this from your point of view.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. There's 4 students from my class here and me, and this was just such a great opportunity. Like, I'm so grateful to be here. But I would say that the death of George Floyd has really ripped open the deep racism in Minnesota. And we are a pretty well-run state. We have pretty good healthcare. We have decent schools. And what we're finding is that has for decades and decades not worked for so many people in our state. And so I just think Howard Thurman, he doesn't just talk about God or Jesus, but he talks about the dignity of every single person. And I hope that we in Minnesota understand that more. We're considered Minnesota nice, but there's more to human dignity than just being quote unquote nice to them. So I really hope that Minnesota takes seriously what has happened here. I don't know if, I'm sorry, that was too much. Thank you so much for this. This was such an amazing learning experience for me.
Well, just as a professor, as you teach this book, I mean, is there any kind of core message beyond that you'd like to impart to your students or challenge them with?
I think that one of the things that I love so much about Howard Thurman, and he's not afraid to talk about hard feelings, especially in Jesus and the Disinherited. He talks about hate. He talks about self-hatred. He talks about self-love and violence. And theology so often wants to focus us on God somewhere else. And I love that Thurman, every individual has to reckon with themselves. So that's our calling as Christians. So I really love what Thurman does here, among so many other things that he gives us.
Yeah. Well, thank you for that mini lecture no, it wasn't a lecture at all. It was so heartfelt, and it's really awesome that we can be together, across the country, across our different places and spaces and work. And what an incredible hour together. This reading is at the theologicalhorizons.org vintage page. Caroline Carr has recorded it for us, so you'll have access to the video and SoundCloud if you'd rather just put it in your ears while you take a walk or protest or whatever you're going to do this weekend. And we will also look up Pam Field's Visible Unity, post that on the page, and Martin Doblmeier's films and where you can stream it. So I hope this is just the beginning of more conversations. We're going to have 3 more Friday virtual vintages through June. Next week, Friday at 1, and you're always welcome. Everybody's welcome. It's kind of a fun one because we're going to talk about Billy Graham, the great American evangelist, with a focus on his response to issues around race. And my father-in-law, Bob Marsh, is going to join us. He's 87 now and had a lot of experience, personal experience, under the ministry of Graham. So it'll be cool to hear Graham's words and hear his point of view. The next Friday, I'm going to bring some Julian of Norwich because, we got to do some throwback Fridays with Julian because she survived the plague and all kinds of horrors. So she's always a good one for like kind of a, could it be worse? Maybe point of view. And then finally, we're going to do a Friday on C.S. Lewis on his essay, Learning in Wartime. And Terry Linval, who's a Lewis scholar, is going to join us. So hopefully a little bit for everybody. So hope to see you again. So as we go, may the Lord Christ go with you wherever he may send you, protect you through the wilderness and guide you through the storm. May he bring you home rejoicing at the wonders he has shown you. May he bring you home rejoicing once again into our doors. Peace. Love y'all. Stay safe. Be well.
Thank you so much.